Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast. Now bear with me because this is going to be one of my longest video introductions, but I think it's warranted given the importance of this particular year for Asian horror. We'll get to the actual movie reviews a bit later in this video. Now we have thus far covered 169 Asian horror films that were released before 1998, which is a solid study, I think. We've seen all of the major trends for each time period, and we've identified a bunch of good movies, as well as some really bad ones. But now we've reached 1998, and this year is considered by many to be ground zero for contemporary Asian horror. And this is due mostly to the release of two popular films: the Japanese horror film Ring-U, known as simply Ring in its home country, and the South Korean horror film Whispering Corridors. Now in terms of industry influence, Ring-U is arguably the most influential Japanese horror film of all time. And its influence was felt in many ways, but there are two industry effects that I'd like to cover here. And many of you probably already know this already, but it's fun to talk about it. Now, number one, it ignited domestic and international recognition and interest in Japanese horror, which ultimately resulted in a significant increase in horror movie production. Now, this increase in production would not ramp up until the year 2004, so there was a delay here. And a lot of people don't realize this. I mean, most people seem to think that once Ring-U came out, the floodgates opened, but that's not exactly the case here. Now, the reason for this delay is that Ring-U had some help from subsequent Asian horror films, as well as better DVD distribution for Asian horror films in the mid-2000s on an international level, which generated additional interest and momentum in the industry that eventually resulted in a production explosion that hit in 2004 that has more or less continued to the present day. And we will cover that phenomenon more in later videos. So one nice aspect of this Asian Horror Year in Review playlist is that you get to see, I guess, how many films are available for each particular year. And you've already seen huge fluctuations in previous years. But we're going to see when we hit the mid-2000s, so we're going to have tons of movies to discuss in each particular year. So you get to see like where the production spikes hit in the industry, which is kind of interesting. Now the second major influence for Ring-U is that it caused a shift in the types of horror movies that Japan produced. Now just consider the titles that we've been talking about in this video series. We covered a wide variety of horror films dating back to the 1950s. But in the mid-1990s, as we've seen, Japan was focusing a little bit more on violent horror films and a little bit less on supernatural creepy horror films, with some exceptions, of course. But that would change after Ring-U's popularity, because the number of ghost films increased significantly after its release, many of which involve the much-maligned Sadako clones, which are basically ghost girls who dress in white, have the long hair over their faces, and move in creepy ways. The proper term, I believe, is onryo, or vengeful spirit, which is a type of yurei, or ghost. I guess those are the Japanese terms. So I like to use the term onryo because it's just easier than saying, the full description of what Sadako looks like. Now, I don't want to get into this particular topic in great detail here because I plan on creating a separate video in the future that specifically addresses this issue, but I will say that we can all relax, okay? We can all relax because there are still plenty of entertaining post-Ring-U Asian horror films that do not have onryo in them. In fact, you could completely ignore onryo films and keep yourself busy for ages, as we've already seen. I mean, it should be obvious when one considers the type of films that we've already discussed, and it will be even more obvious as we explore future years. So whenever I hear someone claim that, all Japanese or Asian horror films are the same because they all have ghost girls, it definitely irritates me. Primarily because it's ignorant and objectively false. It's one thing to have an opinion, it's another thing to state an objective fact, or a fact that is seemingly objective but is actually false. Now, one of the main reasons I created this Asian Horror Year in Review playlist is because it gives me the opportunity to document the huge variety of Asian horror films that are out there. So hopefully that will be helpful to some. Now, when we discuss Whispering Corridors, it was less influential than Ring-U overall, but it was the first truly memorable South Korean horror film. And as you must have noticed from previous videos in this playlist, this country only produced a small handful of horror films prior to 1998, at least from my knowledge they have. That would change, however, and we will see that change when we explore the mid-2000s. But that's another reason why 1998 was an important year for Asian horror, because South Korea finally made their mark with a very good entry. One other interesting tidbit regarding 1998 is that we will come upon our first horror film from Thailand in this playlist. Now, I do assume that Thailand must have made some horror films prior to this year, but those films are probably just not available for viewing on the international market. Regardless, though, it's still obvious that Thailand stepped up their game during the turn of the century, at least in terms of contributing their share of entertaining horror films to international audiences. But with that said, many of Thailand's efforts between 1998 and, say, 2003 were not particularly good films. There are some good ones in there for sure that we're going to cover, but Thai horror really didn't hit its stride until around 2004. Now, before we continue with our reviews of these films, I just have a few more points to make here. And since it's my video, I'm going to make these points, so you have no choice. Well, technically you could turn the video off, but please don't. Now, during our exploration of the 1970s, I concluded that Asian horror simply could not stand toe-to-toe with American horror during the time period. But things began to change, especially during the late 1990s. Asian horror began to produce a greater number of high-quality films on a yearly basis. Because in the past decades and years, we've covered a lot of good movies, but Asian horror began to be more consistent on a year-to-year basis. And because of that, my preferences shifted. So now, I really strongly prefer Asian horror over American horror during the past 20 or so years, say from the late 90s up to the present day. And again, I hope to make a separate video in the future with my specific reasons for this opinion, but hopefully, at least in this playlist, I could point out enough good Asian horror films during the last 20 years to make my case. And finally, there is some debate out there. In fact, there's much debate out there in terms of identifying the best years for Asian horror, with the prevailing opinion being that the best years spanned from 1998 through 2004. At least that's the impression I've gotten over a decade of internet surfing, article reading, and message board posting. I disagree with this assertion. I do. In my opinion, the most outstanding years of Asian horror span from 2004 really all the way to the present time, with a few weak years along the way. Most notably 2011 was a fairly weak year, which we'll see. Now, I do find it ironic and interesting that the quintessential years for Asian horror, in my opinion, began at the very point where popular opinion believes the industry began tailing off in 2004. And the reason for this will be expanded upon when we reach our reviews for those particular years. But overall, I think the problem is that people tend to cherry-pick the great films and then ignore the overall quality of many of the other films released within that particular year. So this is an opinion that I'm fairly passionate about, and it's another one of the main reasons why I created this Asian Horror Year in Review playlist. So at least I can continue to build my case as to why I feel this way. So in summary, of the many interesting things that we've seen and will see in our exploration of Asian horror, there are two subjective opinions that I feel quite strongly about. Number one, the best years for Asian horror were not from 1998 to 2004. And number two, contemporary Asian horror is generally more entertaining than contemporary American horror. And then there is also one objective statement that is impossible to deny, I think, and that is Asian horror has had a huge variety of styles, themes, and subgenres to explore. So much so, in fact, that it easily overpowers any cliches, such as onryo, that are evident within the industry. So just keep these points in mind as we continue with our study. So let's start reviewing some movies from 1998 now, instead of me just blabbering endlessly. Now, due to this lengthy introduction, I am going to split this up into two videos. This video is going to focus on the films that I disliked from 1998, while the next video will cover the better Asian horror films from this year. But it's always fun to hear somebody complain about the films they thought stunk, so hopefully you'll stick around. And as always, titles for all of the movies I discuss are listed in the description box below. So now we're at what I believe to be the worst Asian horror film from 1998, which is an easy choice. And that film is Psycho the Snuff Reels, also known as Tumbling Doll of Flesh. How about that title? Japanese exploitation horror film. Now this is shown almost entirely through a stationary camera and a handheld one. The film is about a woman and a man who are being hired to star in an amateur porno being made by two other men. As the porn shoot progresses, however, it incorporates elements of bondage, multiple penetration with dildos, wax play, flagellation, and an enema. Oh, that's nice. Uncomfortable with how rough the film has gotten, the woman tries to leave, prompting the men to rape and murder her. It's a very complicated storyline. No, it isn't. The ironic thing about these uber-violent Japanese exploitation films is that they frequently bill themselves as disturbing, but usually just end up being less affecting than well-crafted non-exploitation titles. So in this case, the first 40-minute section of Psycho the Snuff Reels is a by-the-book porno, basically, while the remaining runtime consists of disgusting torture scenes. And yes, this is just as nasty as its reputation suggests, but the only possible success of this movie is its ability to provoke an upset stomach. And you've heard me say that a few times before, like, really, some of these nasty films, they give me an upset stomach. They don't really provoke anything else, and that's not the type of experience I want to get from watching a movie. I don't really find it to be entertaining. Now, the production values here are terrible, which is obviously not a plus. I mean, sometimes grainy visuals can add to the experience, but this is just really boring to look at. Very static camera work and I guess really bad, drab visuals. So overall, I mean, I really disliked Psycho the Snuff Reels. But, you know, in my last video I recommended Eat the Schoolgirls, so I don't know what to tell you. Life is crazy. So I didn't go into the specifics regarding the actual violence in this film. There are some, I guess you could call them memorable scenes that are really nasty. So I don't know. If you want to see something really nasty, I guess you could watch it. But I do not recommend this. I actually really disliked it and found it to be really boring. So let's move on. And we're back to one of our franchises here that we're covering extensively in this playlist. And that is Troublesome Night 4. 1998, of course, we're in. Chinese horror, actually a Hong Kong horror anthology. But wait, you must say, in my last video we covered Troublesome Night 1 and 2, and now we're skipping to number 4. But don't worry, Troublesome Night 3 will be covered in part 2 of this video when we cover the better films of 1998, because it was released in the same year and is actually a good movie. And as you know at this point, I like to be organized, and since I'm organizing these films now by quality within the particular year, I gotta put Troublesome Night 4 before 3, so bear with me. So Troublesome Night 4. This is an anthology of 3 short horror films surrounding the supernatural events that happen to various Chinese persons who are vacationing in the Philippines. Now, the first segment is about a guy who transports an urn with ashes. The acting and script writing are both atrocious. Don't watch it. That's all I have to say about that. Second story stars the series regular Louis Koo, who strolls around with his wife, but is pursued by a mysterious pole dancer that endangers the trust of the marriage. Now, the acting is a little better here, mostly due to the presence of Lewis, but the horror elements of script are still very weak. Only a slight improvement over the first segment, just because the acting's a little better, but still unimpressive. Now, the third story also stinks, and is about 2 guys who go whoring, but get more than what they bargained for. Do I even need to tell you what the flaws are in this one? The horror elements in the script are weak, of course. So, one other note is that there are some dashes of humor that are sprinkled into this anthology at various points, but they're completely worthless. That's one thing about Hong Kong horror comedies. There are some good ones, but when they fail, they're tough to sit through, man, because the comedy is real lame and the horror is just real muted and ineffective. Not easy to sit through some of these bad ones, and this one's tough to sit through. Do not recommend Troublesome Night 4. Don't bother. Now the next film is a little less, the Troublesome Night series actually is not well known. This one is even less well known. And this is a Japanese film called Screwed. It's a horror-drama hybrid. Now in Screwed, a writer, recently disturbed by the actions of his faithful girlfriend, wanders into a weird mountain town. Now this was directed by Teruo Ishii, who previously directed The Horrors of Malformed Men, which we reviewed while covering the year 1969. And that was 30 years before Screwed was made, so this guy was around for a while. But unfortunately, this film is not nearly as good as The Horrors of Malformed Men. So after an incredibly bizarre opening scene on a beach, this movie just bored me to death for the middle hour. And then the final 20 minutes make a return to surrealism and weirdness, but somehow it's just still forgettable and completely unengaging, despite the presence of Tadanobu Asano, who's a big-time actor in Japan right now. I'm a big fan of Asano, personally, who has appeared in such films as Ichi the Killer, Survive Style 5, Lupin the Third, Vital, and Electric Dragon 80,000 Volts. But even he can't even save this one. He basically just walks around aimlessly and experiences some weird events. That's about it. I mean, the movie just falls apart. It doesn't even have the craftsmanship necessary to make it work, which is something you see with some of the other films that are kind of weird, kind of surreal, kind of like Cure, which I recommended in my last video, has a very proficient execution to it, and it keeps you engaged, it keeps you really interested in what's happening. Screwed is the exact opposite of that. It's just some weird stuff chucked in, some guy walks around aimlessly, the end. It's like the filmmakers just puked everything out and just left it at that, so forget this film. It's terrible. Now the next film we're covering is a film that's not really as bad as the previous films we've covered, but it really irritated me. And I actually I wouldn't say I'm in the minority on this. This film really has a split opinion among fans, so it's kind of interesting to talk about. I considered it to be a big disappointment. And that is Raisin, also known as Spiral, a Japanese horror film. Now this is actually a sequel to Ring-U, which we will cover in part 2 of this video, that was released during the same year, but it's lesser in every respect. I've read that the film studio basically doubled down and released both films back to back because they wanted to capitalize on the successful novel that they were based on. Ring-U was a huge hit, but Raisin was a bust, and so much so that the studio went on to make Ring-U 2, which in some sense kind of replaced Raisin as the true sequel to Ring-U. And to be perfectly honest, I think Raisin deserved to fail due to its incompetent writing. And we'll get to that in a minute, but first let's lay out the story here. So a doctor, played by Koichi Sato, who I'm a fan of, he's a good actor, investigates the death of his former colleague, who was murdered by Sadako's ghost in Ring-U, with the help of his girlfriend, played by Miki Nakatani. Now, both Sato and Nakatani are very capable actors, with extensive filmographies, so it's no surprise that this is competently acted, so that's one positive to this. But I must say that Ring-U it moves as slow as molasses in January, and the script is just terrible in this movie. It spins its wheels for a while, meanders around, and then seemingly going nowhere with this, and then ultimately moves the story forward in stupefying ways that flat out contradict Ring-U. So Sadako acts, no spoilers in this, so don't worry, but Sadako acts completely differently here for no apparent reason. The scriptwriters then rewrite character motives from Ring-U that already happened to shoehorn these stupid ideas into the story, and it's totally unconvincing and moronic. It's kind of like sticking a square peg into a round hole. Oh, and then there's a weak romance element at work to add insult to injury, and the scares are virtually non-existent. So, it really, the script writing in this film just really irritated me where they went with the story in this film. And I easily prefer Ringu 2 over Raisin. That may or may not be a popular opinion, but I don't care because I don't really think it's even close. And I will cover Ringu 2 when we reach 1999. Now, Raisin, I actually gave it a second chance fairly recently because, some people tend to like it. They think it's really better than Ringu 2. It's kind of a debate which one's better. Which one's the better sequel, so to speak, to Ringu. So I rewatched it again, and I was like, man, I remember why I freaking was so irritated by this movie. Cannot stand the story in this one. So, I can't really completely not recommend Raisin. If you're a fan of the Ringu franchise, you basically have to watch it, but I did not like it. So, alright. We've now reached the first horror film from Thailand that we will be covering in this YouTube series, and it's unfortunately not a good one. Now, with regard to Thai horror, as I mentioned before, I don't believe this industry hit its stride until Shudder was released in 2004. So of the dozen or so Thai horror films that I've seen that were released before Shudder, I've only enjoyed 2 out of the dozen or so. That's not good. Of the 44 Thai horror films that I've seen that were released after Shudder, I enjoyed 28 of them. So definitely, things improved a lot for Thai horror over time. But we have to slug through their weaker years here. So the first Thai horror film we're covering here is a film called 303 Fear, Faith, Revenge. Boys at a Catholic school form a club to discover the details behind an apparent suicide of a student 10 years earlier. Now, this is a typical Catholic boarding school with some strict rules in play, so that's kind of the backdrop. And these students hear a rumor about a mysterious suicide case of an honor student whose name was in the school's Hall of Fame. So their curiosity to find the truth leads them into a horrific situation, with students and staff members being brutally murdered while the entire campus is trapped on top of the hill because a landslide blocks the only access road out. So this film has some jump scares that are very shameless and very cliched. You know the ones I'm talking about. The cat scenes. The scenes that usually involve cats. You know what I'm talking about. This film has those. The friendly slap on the back of someone's shoulder. Oh yeah, this film uses that as well. You just kind of like roll your eyes when you see scenes like that. This was back in '98, and it was brutally overplayed by that point. And that's basically what you're in for here. The murders are lame. The acting is subpar too, so it doesn't even have a foundation of quality to it, really. The film just immediately starts off mediocre and just gets worse as it progresses. So kind of a swing and a miss for Thailand here. I don't recommend this one. Alright, the next one here is a film called The Untold Story 2, Hong Kong horror film. So this Category 3 film is not a sequel necessarily, but more of a cash-in on the popularity of the original film. It's almost like an unrelated, I wouldn't even say spin-off. It's just kind of a different story, but kind of in the same universe or something like that. I don't know. I don't know why they call it Untold Story 2, to be honest with you, other than just cashing in on the original. So the plot here is that an unhappy married couple invite the wife's beautiful cousin, who has survived a horrifying experience in mainland China, to live with them. Now this lady has her own special way of overcoming hardship and becomes the master of a barbecue. She's apparently a good cook. And that's basically the setup here. And if you've seen the first film, you probably know where this is going, because there's some similarities there. Now in terms of exploitation elements, it's run-of-the-mill stuff here. And it's not like the script is going to compensate, because that's weak too. So there's really nothing in terms of real memorable violence. There might be one or two decent scenes, but don't really go into this expecting that. There's also too much lame comedy tossed in as well. Anthony Wong does have a supporting role here as a different character from his character in the first film, but even he doesn't add a whole lot to this. It's just dull overall, you know, and that's why I call it a cash-in. It just feels like just a lazy, almost like adaptation of the original. They do mix it up. Everything doesn't play out exactly the same, but I don't know. I didn't like it. There's apparently a third film in this franchise, but I've never seen it. So I don't recommend Untold Story 2, obviously. Alright, last film here for tonight. Now this one I'm actually in the minority of disliking it. It's fairly popular, to be honest with you. And that's a film called Bio Zombie, Hong Kong horror comedy. Now, a small group of people find themselves at the mercy of zombies in a shopping mall, in this film by director Wilson Yip. Now, I mentioned in my last video that Yip would go on to direct a series of outstanding martial arts films starring Donnie Yen, such as the Ip Man trilogy, Killzone, Flashpoint, etc. Now, Bio Zombie is easily the most popular film of his that was released before Killzone, with a fairly solid internet fan base to it. But unfortunately, I simply don't like this one, despite watching it multiple times and giving it multiple chances. So the first 15 minutes have a few funny scenes, but are largely uneventful, dull, and kind of stupid. It's kind of like a long setup period. The protagonists are somewhat annoying at times. A few of them are likable, others are kind of annoying, which is a problem that I have with a lot of zombie movies, Asian or otherwise. Seems like it takes forever for this movie to get to the zombie action. And, but, you know, the middle half hour does have some legitimate entertainment value, with some good zombie kills and some better pacing. Then comes an overly long and overdramatic death of a protagonist, which just derails things for a bit. It's really melodramatic and out of place. It's hard to watch that scene, and not for the right reasons. But the film kind of rebounds again during the final 10 minutes with a good parking lot brawl. So Bio Zombie, in my opinion, really isn't a bad film by any means, but I just think the negatives just kind of outweigh the positives a little bit. But as I said, this movie does have its fans, and I can see why it's generally liked. So if you like zombie films, you may want to check it out. It is available on YouTube if you want to, go that route. So we finished the less impressive films from 1998, but don't worry, because in my next video in this playlist is going to cover the more enjoyable films from this particular year. So stay tuned for that, and as always, see you next time.